Every year, the village had to choose a girl of age to become the Blossom Bride. The girl who was chosen would be sent into the cave as the village god's wife. She would spend the entire night with him. If she came out alive, she would be honored for the rest of her life as a village elder. Any child she bore was said to be blessed, destined for a life of effortless fortune. If she died, the village would simply wait for the next year, when another Blossom Bride would be chosen. The blessing of the Blossom Bride was believed to pass on to her parents and elders as well. However, no one wanted to be chosen. To escape the ritual, families quietly left the village one after another. I was the only one who volunteered. I had a lust problem, and I had always wondered what it would feel like to be with a god. The day before the sacrifice, I was sprawled on my bed at home, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. Suddenly, the yard outside was filled with people. The village chief walked in front of the crowd. "Josie, we've come to bring you good news." I rolled off the bed and jumped to my feet. "Chief, can I finally become the Blossom Bride?" The chief smiled warmly. "Your older sister went into the cave last year. By right, it shouldn't be your turn yet. But since you insisted, we opened the ancestral hall and asked the ancestors for guidance. If performed the ritual to ask for ancestors' approval, and they agreed. So it is settled. You'll go? That is great." I was so happy, I practically leapt into the air. The chief raised a hand, telling me not to get too excited. "These are the things you'll need to prepare. We'll send you off tomorrow morning at 8. I've asked a few experienced women to help you get ready. If you don't understand anything, just ask them." I quickly thanked him. I've never done this before. What exactly am I supposed to do on the wedding night? One of the neighbors frowned. "We'll teach you tonight. We need to help you prepare your wedding clothes now." I dashed into my room and came right back out, carrying a full set of bridal robes and a headdress in my arms. I've always dreamed of marrying a god, so I prepared these long ago. Our village had not been doing well these past few years. More and more people had left to work in the cities. I was the only unmarried woman left among those who stayed. Thus, even though I was already 28, I was still chosen. As someone who had dreamed since childhood of marrying a god, I had been preparing for this day for a very long time. The moment the village chief and the others left, I eagerly asked the older women how I was supposed to serve the god. One of them stepped into my room and immediately noticed the scattered items on my bed. Her expression changed immediately. "Josie, tell us the truth. Are you still untouched?" "Of course I am." "Then what are all these?" I calmly picked up the items and began introducing them one by one. "These are my secret weapons. None of the Blossom Brides in recent years has managed to conceive the god's child. That is because those women just weren't capable enough. I went to consult a fortune teller, and she said I should use these. With them, I can get pregnant whenever I want." One of the women took one uncertainly. "Are these things really that powerful?" "Of course. If you like them, take one each." "I have plenty." I opened my drawer and handed out several unopened ones. Each of them cost over $1,000. The women were instantly won over. Not only did they teach me how to speak to the god, but they even warned me that I must never open my eyes, no matter what happened during the night. I was so excited that I told them my biggest secret. The fortune teller who read my fate said, "I have an exceptionally fertile body. As long as someone sleeps with me, I'll surely get pregnant and bear a child." I lowered my voice and added, "That is why I've never given myself to anyone before other than a god. No one deserves a body like mine." The item in one of the women's hands dropped to the floor. When she noticed me looking at her, she quickly forced a smile. "That is wonderful. The future of our village depends on you to be safe." After fasting and bathing as they instructed, I was pinned to the bed for a physical inspection. After hours of checking my body, especially my lower half, the women finally relaxed. "You are so pure. He will surely favor you. Listen carefully to what we say next. This is the key to gaining the god's favor. Every step must be done perfectly." They kept me busy until midnight, going over every single detail. The next morning at 8, I was led to the ancestral hall. The hall stood at the center of the village. Normally, only men were allowed inside. Women were not even permitted to bow at the entrance. Chosen Blossom Bride was the only one who could enter. The moment I stepped over the threshold, my thoughts swirled. It was like I had experienced the same thing before, but the details were hazy, slipping from my memory.
Don't daydream.
Bow to the ancestors and ask for their blessing. Half an hour later, the tedious rituals were finally complete. One of the women guided me to the backyard. She was about to help me into my bridal robes under the sun. I clutched my chest, reluctant to undress. This isn't right. There are men nearby, and my body is only meant for the god. Why should they see it? The women's eyes flashed. They're just the men who check the god's brides. You will only be allowed up the mountain once you pass their section of the ritual. I let go of my hands, silently. even though I had watched countless videos. I could not stop myself from blushing. When my last layer of clothing hit the ground, half an hour later, I emerged from the back, fully dressed in a dainty crown and ceremonial gown. He looked up and caught the eyes of several of the village men. Their eyes were red, and their throats were bobbing as though they were swallowing hard. The village chief nodded approvingly. "Let's go." He raised his hand, and suddenly music swelled outside. Unlike the festive tunes of a normal wedding, marrying a god was solemn and grand. The music was ancient, almost sacred, and listening to it twice made it feel like my soul had been cleansed. My head was dizzy. I remembered nothing except following the procession out of the hall. Halfway along the path, I accidentally tripped over my own feet. I fell to my knees. My palm scraped hard against the rough stone, leaving a trail of blood behind me. Blood on such a joyful day is a bad omen. The village chief's face turned gloomy. I quickly pulled a charm from my chest. If this is a talisman from the fortune teller, it ensures my wishes come true and everything goes smoothly. The fortune teller predicted my day would start with sorrow and end in joy. See, though I am bleeding now, everything will turn out well. My words seemed to satisfy the chief and the elders, and the procession continued. However, for some reason, the cut on my hand would not heal, leaving streaks of blood along the path. The pain made it impossible to focus on the sacred music. As soon as we began ascending the mountain, a blindfold was placed over my eyes. The village chief said that the god favored pure eyes, so I must not see the spirits of the mountain, otherwise I would be rejected. With my vision taken away, my other senses sharpened. I could feel the uneven ground beneath my feet, and the music behind me seemed to seep into my bones, intruding everywhere. The air, once thick with a sense of village smoke and cooking, was now cold and empty. I clenched my hands tighter as the pain in my palm seared. I had no idea how long we walked, for the sun seemed to have climbed to its peak. I was finally allowed to remove the blindfold. Before me stretched a winding, narrow path that ended in a bottomless cave. Beside it stood a towering, ancient tree. Its scent of osmanthus drifted even from afar. The villagers said the tree had absorbed the essence of countless blossom brides. That was what made it so tall and fragrant. When we were 30 feet away from the cave, the procession abruptly stopped, the chief's small, cloudy eyes fixed on me. "You really plan to go in?" My cheeks flushed red, and I lowered my gaze to the cave. "Yes. I've waited my whole life for this. Our god is so tall and imposing, a match for me unlike any other. Despite my age, I've never known a man's touch." The villagers frowned at my blunt words, and even the chief looked displeased. However, I had already passed all the trials that morning. I possessed the blessing of fertility they had long desired. Even if the chief did not want me to go in, he could only turn a blind eye. There are no unmarried girls left in the village. This difficult task falls to you, Josie. My cheeks burned. "Don't worry, chief. I'll bring back the god's blessing. Our village will thrive again." No one else was allowed beyond this point. They could only accompany me to the entrance. I moved quickly, stepping onto the narrow path that led to the cave. The sweet scent of osmanthus and the warmth of sunlight faded behind me. They were replaced by the musky, earthy smells of decay and foliage. My heart raced. When I finally saw the muscular man at the end of the path, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. "Are you the god?" I whispered, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a wild, intoxicating rush of anticipation. He remained motionless and stayed silent. Only when I drew closer did I see him resting on a stone chair. In the heavy, damp gloom of the cavern, his chest slightly rose and fell, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that proved he was alive. His silhouette was massive, his bare shoulders broad and imposing in the shadows, fitting the image of the towering deity the villagers had painted in my mind since childhood. I knelt, just as the women had instructed, offering myself in devotion. "I offer myself to you as my gift," I said, my voice echoing softly against the damp stone walls. "I am Josie. I'm 28, and tonight I come before you as your chosen one." They had told me that the god would not react, and that it was my role to offer myself fully. Even as a single woman with no real experience, I was familiar with every step of the rite. The village elders had drilled it into me, thinking they were preparing a mindless, lust-driven lamb for the slaughter. They had no idea how meticulously I had studied their movements, how eagerly I had awaited this exact threshold. With each step I took forward, a layer of my ceremonial robes fell away. Silk and heavy embroidery pooled onto the cold, dusty floor of the cave like shedding skin. By the time I reached the stone chair, I was left wearing only the simplest undergarments beneath my outer cloak. The cave air was frigid, raising goosebumps along my arms and sending shivers down my spine, but my face burned with a feverish heat. The older women's voices echoed in my mind. Though the god does not move, his presence is warm. You must engage fully, or you will not survive the first 2 days. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I loosened the god's ceremonial robes, letting them slide off his broad shoulders. He was stripped of all unnecessary layers, now bare and unadorned like me. In the dim, filtered light of the cave entrance, I could make out the sharp, heavy contours of his body. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. I instinctively moved closer to him, pressing my face against his firm, defined abs. Have previous brides ever touched here? I murmured, my breath hot against his cold skin. I leaned close to his ear, my heart hammer beating against my ribs. It feels so warm here. Can you please hug me? I waited, expecting the sudden, violent grip of a primordial entity, but there was nothing. No arms rose to encircle me. No divine whisper filled the hollow chamber. Instead, as my cheek rested against his chest, I heard the rapid, erratic fluttering of a human heart and the unmistakable, faint scent of a synthetic sedative clinging to his skin. A cold dread, entirely separate from my feigned lust, washed over me. I pressed my fingers into his collarbone. His skin was clammy. His pupils, when I peeled back his heavy eyelids, were pinned, reflecting none of the sacred light I had expected. This was no god. This was a man. A heavily drugged, captive man. Suddenly, a faint rustling sound echoed from the dark fissures deeper within the cave. Ah! I panicked, tumbling back and hastily wrapping myself in my clothes as I retreated to a corner. The place where people had been standing, the threshold where the village chief and the elders had bid me farewell, was suddenly empty. The heavy wooden gate at the cave's mouth had been slid shut, sealing the entrance. Had I imagined the noise? I looked up. There were a few small holes in the ceiling, which normally let thin shafts of sunlight in. They were now covered by thick, low-hanging storm clouds, plunging the cavern into near-total darkness. My phone had been confiscated when we entered the mountain. The chief and the village elders had warned that no modern devices were allowed. Bringing them was considered highly disrespectful, and they claimed any such offense would bring the god's wrath upon the entire village. But I hadn't come unprepared. After fumbling around in the dark, my fingers scraping against the rough stone floor, I finally found a hidden lighter in the folds of my discarded wedding garments. A sudden spark ignited, the small yellow flame dancing in the drafty air. Without hesitation, I set a portion of my outer ceremonial robes on fire, throwing them onto a dry pile of pine needles near the center of the chamber. The flickering flames quickly caught, casting a bright, dancing orange light across the grim walls of the dark cave. I did not dare wander into the deep recesses of the cavern, so I cautiously searched the small, illuminated area around me. No one else appeared, but the light finally allowed me to get a clear view of the figure before me. He was half reclined in the stone chair, his muscular body trembling slightly as the sedative began to wear off. His face was rugged, covered in a light stubble, his jaw clenched in pain. He was definitely not from our village. The man stared at my hand without a word. His eyes, hazy but rapidly clearing, tracked the movement of the firelight. Then, in the next moment, he lunged forward with surprising speed and grasped my hand. However, he did not grab the left hand I had reached out to steady myself, but the right one. The one I had kept hidden behind my back, cradling the lighter and my hidden tools. "No men are allowed in here," he rasped, his voice deep, gravelly, and laced with pain. He looked up at me, his eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, piercing intensity that didn't belong to a mindless deity. "You could have ended me just now. So why save me?" I stood frozen for a fraction of a second before slowly opening my right hand, revealing the mottled scars and dried blood that lined my palm and fingers. Deep, jagged wounds ran along my flesh, wounds that had absolutely nothing to do with tripping on a rough stone path on the way up the mountain. They were the fresh, angry marks left by handling sharp wire, metallic fuses, and the heavy, rusted tools required to carry out a year-long, solitary operation of sabotage. The man's gaze drifted from my scarred palm back to my face. "What secrets are you hiding?" I responded simply. With my left hand, I drew the small, razor-sharp hunting knife I had hidden in the thick, padded hem of my bridal undergarments and pressed the cold steel directly against the hollow of his neck. "Shut up," I hissed. He seemed entirely unfazed by the blade at his throat. In fact, a dark, cynical laugh rumbled in his chest, though it cut off into a grimace of pain as he shifted on the stone chair. "I underestimated you," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Good thing I didn't underestimate you either," I whispered, nudging the knife forward just enough to indent his skin without breaking it. "If I hadn't saved you just now, you'd be like the other men who entered here, knocked me out, and dragged me away. If I had cooperated with the elders, they might have sent me away tomorrow morning, letting me live out my days as a hollow, traumatized elder to keep their secrets. But if I resisted, I pointed my chin toward a dark, collapsed corner of the cave, where the flickering firelight barely reached. My outcome would have been exactly the same as theirs. There, half buried under a thin layer of dry earth and entangled in the thick, pale roots of the ancient osmanthus tree growing outside, lay the unmistakable, sickening gleam of white bones. Small, fragile ribs, shattered limbs, and tattered remnants of bright red bridal silk from years past. And among them, a tarnished silver hairpin that I would recognize anywhere. It belonged to Clara, my older sister, the Blossom Bride of last year. The man in the chair followed my gaze, his expression hardening. The drug was clearly losing its grip on him, his muscles tensing as he slowly sat upright, ignoring the knife still resting against his throat. "You're Clara's sister," he said, the gravel in his voice settling into a steady, authoritative tone. "Josie. I saw your picture in the missing persons file. I'm Detective Vance. I've been tracking this village's human trafficking ring for 6 months. I snuck onto the mountain 3 days ago to locate the burial site, but the chief's goons ambushed me, drugged me, and left me here to play the role of their god for your wedding night. They were going to use me to violate you, then kill us both and frame it as a tragic double suicide to close the investigation." The knife in my hand didn't waver, but a cold, hard satisfaction settled deep into my chest. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together. "So there's no god," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "There never was. Just a succession of drugged victims, village men taking turns in the dark, and a mountain of bodies buried under the roots of that wretched tree to keep the village's dark, profitable secrets alive." "Yes," Vance rasped, grabbing his head as a sudden wave of nausea hit him. "The chief has a network of buyers in the city. The girls who disappear or die during the ritual are either murdered because they fight back or sold off to the highest bidder once they are dragged out through the rear shafts of this cave. The blessing of wealth the parents receive is nothing more than the hush money payments from the sales. They keep the villagers quiet, and the ones who try to run are hunted down." I slowly lowered the knife, my mind flashing back to Clara's tear-stained face the night she was chosen. She had begged the chief, begged our parents, but they had forced her up the mountain with wide, greedy smiles. They had called it a holy sacrifice. "They broke her bones," I whispered, my gaze fixed on the silver hairpin in the dirt. "They stripped her, broke her, and threw her to the earth like garbage. And my parents took the money and bought a new tractor." "Josie," Vance said, his hand reaching out to touch my arm, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here. The rear shaft is blocked, but if we can find a way to signal." "I'm not leaving," I interrupted, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across my lips. I reached into the inner pockets of my heavy cloak and began pulling out the secret weapons I had proudly displayed to the village women the night before. I laid them out on the flat surface of a nearby boulder. They weren't fertility talismans. The glittering silver tubes were heavy-duty military-grade blasting caps. The hormone syringes were industrial liquid detonators filled with a highly unstable compound I had spent a fortune acquiring on the black market. And the black, dense blocks stuffed into the lining of my bridal gown were plastic explosives. Vance's jaw dropped as he stared at the arsenal laid out before him. What is all of this?" "I told the women these were my secret weapons to ensure pregnancy," I said, a dark chuckle escaping my throat. "I told them each one cost over $1,000. It wasn't a lie. It takes a lot of money to buy enough C4 to bring down an entire mountain." For the past year, while the village thought I was a broken, eccentric woman suffering from a lust problem and a delusional obsession with the cave god, I had been sneaking up the mountain every single night. I had drilled into the support pillars of the cavern, mapping out the structural weaknesses of the peak. I had carried up a few kilograms of explosives day by day, hiding them deep within the crevices where the god was said to sleep. "There are over 100 kilograms of explosives wired throughout this cavern, Vance," I said, my eyes reflecting the wild, dancing flames of my burning robes. "And the main trigger is right here in my pocket." I pulled out a small, modified digital transmitter, its red LED light pulsing like a miniature, angry heartbeat in the dark. "You're insane," Vance whispered, though there was a sudden, dark trace of respect in his eyes. "If you detonate this, you'll bring the entire ridge down on the village. You'll kill everyone." "Only the ones who deserve it," I replied. "The chief, the elders, they come up here every year on the morning after the wedding to collect the bride and the god's tribute. When they realize I'm not dead, they'll come in here to finish the job. And that's when we pay the rent." Before Vance could reply, the heavy wooden gate at the mouth of the cave rattled violently. The sound of scraping stone and muffled, coarse laughter echoed down the narrow path. The storm outside had broken, and the sound of heavy rain began to patter against the ceiling holes, but the voices approaching were distinct. Why destroy something so young and so soft? Can't I have a little fun first? The voice was raspy, wet, and filled with a disgusting, familiar malice. It was Elder Thomas, the chief's right-hand man, the one who had checked my body in the ancestral hall just hours ago with those red, greedy eyes. "Wait your turn, Thomas," another voice sneered. "The village chief. We need to make sure the drug kept the detective quiet first. If he's dead, we throw him in the sinkhole. If the girl survived, we package her up for the transport van at the base of the ridge. The buyers are waiting." Vance's muscles tensed, his hand dropping to the stone floor to search for a rock, a weapon, anything. But his body was still betraying him, his limbs heavy from the lingering effects of the sedative. "Stay down," I whispered to him, my eyes locking onto the entrance. "Let them come." I slipped into the shadows behind the stone chair, my hand gripping the hunting knife, my thumb resting lightly on the detonator's activation switch. The heavy wooden barrier slid open with a sickening groan. The bright, artificial beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the smoke of my burning robes, sweeping across the damp cave walls. "What the hell is that smell?" Thomas grunted, stepping into the chamber. "Is something on fire?" The girl set her clothes on fire. The chief's voice echoed, cold and calculating. "Stupid B***TCH. She must have had a lighter hidden. Find her." Thomas stepped forward, his flashlight beam landing on the stone chair. He saw Vance, who was struggling to stand, his bare torso glistening with sweat in the firelight. "The detective's awake," Thomas yelled, reaching for a heavy iron pipe tucked into his belt. "I'll put the bastard back to sleep. He never saw me coming." I stepped out of the shadows behind him like a ghost clad in tattered bridal silk. The hunting knife in my hand flashed in the firelight. I drove the blade deep into his right shoulder blade, twisting it with all the strength in my 28-year-old body. Thomas shrieked, a horrifying, high-pitched scream of agony that bounced off the cavern walls. The iron pipe clattered to the stone floor as he collapsed to his knees, his flashlight spinning away, casting wild, chaotic shadows across the ceiling. The chief froze at the entrance, his small, cloudy eyes widening in absolute horror as he saw me standing over his partner, my hands and bridal gown splattered with fresh, bright red blood. "Josie, you?" the chief stammered, his hand reaching into his coat for a weapon. "Just me?" I laughed, a sharp, manic sound that echoed the nightmares that had haunted me for a year. "How do you like your Blossom Bride, Chief?" I didn't give him a chance to pull his gun. I lunged forward, kicking the discarded iron pipe directly into the chief's shins. He stumbled backward with a sickening crack, his heavy wooden chest of gold and documents, which he had brought up to finalize the sale, dropping to the ground, scattering paper and gold coins across the dirt. Thomas was writhing on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder, crying out for mercy. "Please, Josie, please stop." He whimpered, his face pale, his chest heaving. I crouched beside him, the tip of my bloody knife tracing the line of his jaw. "This is exactly how my sister Clara begged you for her life. Did you spare her, Thomas? Did you spare any of them?" "No," Vance's voice rang out, steady and cold, as he finally stood up, leaning against the stone chair for support. "They didn't. They tortured them, broke them, and sold them. They are no human beings, Josie. They are demons." "Don't worry," I said, looking down at the weeping elder with absolute contempt. "I'm not going to kill you yet. I need you both to stay alive just long enough to tell the world what you've done." I pulled a bottle of industrial-grade rubbing alcohol and a packet of heavy pain relief powder from my cloak, the same items I had shown the village women. I splashed the alcohol directly onto Thomas's open wound, making him scream and convulse in agony, before dusting it with the pain relief powder to keep him from passing out from shock. "Keep them here," I told Vance, handing him the iron pipe. "I have a broadcast to make." I walked over to the chief, who was crawling toward his scattered documents, his ankle broken and twisted at an unnatural angle. I dragged him by his collar back to the center of the chamber, piling him next to the whimpering Thomas. I reached into the chief's coat pocket and pulled out his modern, high-end smartphone. He had confiscated mine, but he had kept his own to coordinate the sale of my body. With a few quick swipes, I unlocked his phone, bypassed his security, and launched a live streaming application, linking it directly to the regional news forums and social media channels I had spent months preparing to target. The title of the stream was simple: The Truth of the Blossom Bride. The dim, smoky cave, the blood-splattered bridal gown, and the two powerful village elders bound and bleeding on the floor made the live stream explode in popularity within minutes. The viewer count ticked upward with terrifying speed: 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, and within 15 minutes, over 100,000 people were watching live. I pointed the camera directly at my own face, my hair wild and matted with dirt, my hands stained with blood. "Let me explain how I planned all of this," I said to the camera, my voice echoing clearly through the speaker. "A year ago, the elders of this village killed my sister, Clara. They stripped her, broke her bones, and buried her under the osmanthus tree outside this cave. That's when my plan for revenge began. The chat on the screen was a blur of frantic questions, horror, and disbelief. For the past year, I sneaked onto this mountain at night whenever no one was around. I continued, panning the camera to the blocks of plastic explosives wired into the stone pillars. I brought a little bit of C4 each day until I had enough explosives to turn this entire peak into dust. And right now, the detonator is in my hand. I panned the camera to the chief, who was sobbing, his face pressed against the wet dirt. "Speak, chief," I commanded, kicking him in the ribs. "Tell the world where the money comes from. Tell them about the transition vans at the base of the ridge. Tell them about Clara. We sold them." The chief sobbed, his voice carrying over the wind howling through the cave mouth. "The buyers, they paid us, we buried the ones who didn't survive. Please, Josie, turn it off. Tell the god to stop." "There is no god," I yelled down at him, my voice carrying over the rising wind and the sirens that were beginning to wail in the distance. "There is only the soil, and it's time to pay the rent." The live stream was a massive bombshell. Within an hour, the online outcry was so immense that the state authorities had no choice but to bypass the local corrupt police. The roar of a SWAT helicopter began to vibrate through the cavern ceiling, its searchlights cutting through the heavy rain outside. At the base of the mountain, a massive convoy of state police and tactical units had already mobilized. The village chief, his hands bound in heavy plastic ties, was dragged out of the cave entrance by Vance and shoved to the front of the police line as they reached the mountain ridge. "Lead the way," the commanding police officer barked, shoving the chief forward. "Sir, it's not that I don't want to," the chief whimpered, his face pale as he looked up at the darkened peak. "But without instructions from the god, we can't just enter the mountain. The whole ridge is wired. She'll blow us all to hell." The police officer put on a cold expression and glared at him. "There are 4 hours left until the bomb goes off at 7. If you don't lead us in to clear those detonators, no one in this village is going to survive. Move." Professionals were already clearing the narrow path, their metal detectors and bomb disposal gear scanning the muddy earth. Inside the cave, the tension in my body finally began to ease. The heavy bronze crown I had worn up the mountain was gone, discarded in the dirt, and my hands were stained with the green, glowing moss and copper-scented blood of the corrupt men who had ruled my life. Vance stood beside me, his breathing shallow but stable as the police medics finally reached us, kneeling down to check our vitals. "Do you feel any pain or discomfort anywhere?" a female paramedic asked me, her hands gentle as she wrapped a warm blanket around my shoulders. I clenched my teeth, staring at the cave entrance, refusing to let my guard down until the last of the village elders were loaded into the transport vans. "Don't worry," the paramedic said softly, sensing my hostility. "They've been caught. The village chief and the remaining elders have already given their full statements at the base of the hill. You're safe now, Josie." I still did not speak. I couldn't. The silence in my head was deafening, the storm that had raged inside me for a year finally settling into a quiet, cold ash. Vance looked at me, a soft, understanding smile on his rugged face. "Are you ready to look for your sister?" The last of the tension in my body fully collapsed, and I slowly rose to my feet, leaning heavily on Vance's shoulder as we walked toward the dark corner of the cave. "All the bodies are in pieces," Vance said quietly, his hand resting on my shoulder as the forensics team began setting up their bright white halogen lights over the shallow graves. "The sorting will take a lot of work. The medical examiners say it will take days to identify everyone. Can you wait?" I looked at the silver hairpin resting in my palm, my thumb tracing the worn, tarnished metal. I nodded slowly. "I've been waiting a year. A few more days don't matter." "Let's get you to a hospital first," Vance said, gently guiding me toward the cave entrance. As we stepped out of the suffocating, dark mouth of the cavern, the heavy storm clouds finally parted. The brilliant, golden light of the setting sun fell across the mountain ridge, illuminating the ancient osmanthus tree. For the first time in my life, the scent of the blossoms didn't smell like decay. It just smelled like rain.